Hi there, my name is Kazak. I write the Frost Death Knight guide for Wowhead, and I'm also a major contributor to the Frost Death Knight module for Simulation Craft, and I'm here to bring you a guide for Frost Death Knight in 11.2. Frost got its biggest rework that it's gotten in a very long time. I'd say even bigger than the Dragonflight reworks when we got the new talent tree, because that was mostly just taking stuff we had in Shadowlands and turning it into talent form. This is really the biggest shakeup the spec has gotten since probably Legion ish. It's been a long time since it's been changed this much. So, for this video, I'm going to cover the rework and what has changed for this week and what you need to know to start playing Frost Death Knights. I'm going to hold off on talking too much about best in slot gear or stats or trinkets or things of that nature because there is still another week until the season comes out. Anything I say today is probably going to be left null and void. So, really just going to focus on the gameplay impacts that you should be caring about as this rework goes out. Although I will say that there is a reason I am standing up here on top of Ice Crown and have a two-hander in my hand. It's thematically appropriate for the way things are currently looking to play out. So let's look at the talent tree and kind of cover what it looks like and kind of cover the high level changes. First, I don't know, maybe the biggest single change is that Obliterate can no longer damage multiple targets. Cleaving Strikes has been updated so that Frost Scythe deals increased damage during Remorseless Winter, and so Obliterate can no longer cleave. And Frost Strike also now no longer has any sort of AoE component. I'll get into Frostbane later, but this used to be Shattered Frost, which dealt AoE damage based on your Frost Strike's damage, and that is no longer the case. They are single target only buttons, and now you have Frost Scythe and Glacial Advance, which has been moved to the spec itself. You learn this, I think, at level like somewhere between 8 or 12, pretty early on. And you now have this baseline AoE Runic Power Spender, and it also applies Razor Ice. Frost Scythe has been reworked from Dragonflight. It now is effectively the Obliterate but AoE button. It deals damage to enemies in front of you. It costs 2 runes. It consumes Killing Machine. When it does, its critical strikes do 4 times the damage. That's a fun bit of flavor that carried over from the previous Frost Scythe, and it does have a implication for talents later on that I'll try to remember to circle back on. The next biggest change is Empower Rune Weapon is totally redone. It is no longer a just passive buff that gives us haste and resources, and you just kind of use when you're using cooldowns or use when you're trying to roll through a mechanic with breath. It now instead launches a projectile at enemies, and there's a bit of damage. It's an okay bit of damage, and then generates runic power and grants you Killing Machine. This is basically the get out of downtime button. It is loosely similar to Fire Blast. I don't want to say that it's our version of Fire Blast exactly, because there's the ways that fire mages play around Fire Blast is not how we will play around a power rune weapon, but it feels very similar if you've ever played Fire Mage, where it's this off GCD button you kind of weave into your rotation and stops it from ever slowing down too much. And right below that is a very important node. Frostbound Will, consuming Rhyme, reduces the cooldown of Empower Rune Weapon by 6 seconds. And that will segue really nicely into the third biggest change with the rework is that Rhyme no longer procs from Obliterate. Rhyme now procs from your Runic Power Spenders, Frost Strike and Glacial Advance, and from there it does pretty much the same thing. There was a version of Breath on the PTR that still consumed Runic Power, and when it did, that also procced Rhyme, and that was pretty neat. Unfortunately, that version of Breath did not make it to live, and So that ties back to Frostbound Will and Empower Rune Weapon and the rest of the rotation in a pretty neat way. So you spend your killing machine with Obliterate, and then you hit Frost Strike, and you get a Rhyme proc, and you get another killing machine. You can now spend that killing machine and leave that Rhyme there, and then once that GCD is done, you can go back and consume the Rhyme. And so the rotation it's going to feel simple, but it has a really nice flow to it where each of the abilities supports the others, and you never run into this spot where you just start flat out ignoring a button, which is a really big problem for Frost before this rework. Sometimes you would just completely ignore runic power. You would only ever hit Frost Strike if you were trying to do something like regenerate a rune, or you had nothing else going on. You'd often ignore Rhyme, especially in the War Within. Rhyme was just kind of a like, oh, I can't do anything else during breath. I'll hit Rhyme. If I'm in AoE, maybe I'll hit it above Frost Strike, but you really kind of ignored it. But now Rhyme is positioned in such a way that you can never really flat out ignore it. Because even if Rhyme Empowered Howling Blast does not do a lot of damage by itself, but it's going to give you more Empowered Rune Weapon cast, which means more runic power and more killing machines, so that your abilities that you do care about do more damage overall. Speaking of Breath of Sindragosa no longer drains runic power continuously, instead it has a flat cost. And every time you consume Rhyme or Killing Machine, it increases the duration. It also grants a charge of Empower Rune Weapon at the start. I could probably do an entire video talking about Breath of Sindragosa and what it is now and the changes it went through on the PTR, but I'll try to be brief here. I think a lot of people are upset and happy about this for the wrong reasons, or they don't realize that this isn't what they think it is. I think a lot of people read this and feel like, oh, they've completely dumbed down breath. There's no more skill expression. It's just, Gathering Storm, but with a different flavor on it. And the people who have hated breath are going, great, it's not attached to runic power anymore. So perfect, I can play that, because I always hated that talent because I would mess up or I'd accidentally press Frost Strike and I would lose all my damage, or I'd have downtime. That was probably the biggest one people would complain about, is they would hit downtime and get a random mechanic on a boss, they'd be forced out of melee, and they would lose breath. So far, it seems like nothing has really changed for how Breath of Sindragosa actually plays out. I think the people who are upset about this, I think most of them would be happy with a weak aura that turns the duration of the buff into a bar that oscillates back and forth the way the Runic Power bar did under Old Breath. And I think that would pretty much solve most of their issue with this. You can say something like, oh, but using AMS to generate RP, or using a power rune weapon at just the right time when you're out of melee to extend breath. I understand why that feels good, but I would challenge you to think really about what the gameplay of breath was, and it was just to hit obliterate as much as possible. The expression of trying to min-max your breath really has not been present with breath for a long time. In Dragonflight, we had infinite breath, 90-second breaths, and there were some kind of neat cases where you could really roll a breath a long time. But I mean, when it lasts 90 seconds, even with kind of mediocre gameplay, it's kind of hard to feel like there's meaningful skill expression and pushing that, because it's so easy to keep up. And in the War Within, breath just doesn't do enough damage for that skill expression to really come out. Back in Legion, Breath of Sindragosa was our damage leader. All of your gameplay revolved around that 2-minute cooldown burst, and that was really fun. And I don't blame people for wanting to go back to that. I want to go back to that. I'd really like that gameplay back, but unfortunately, hasn't been present in a long time, and breath has actually not done much damage to the point where its main contribution to your damage was actually the way they would proc runic empowerment and generate more runes so you could keep pressing obliterate with killing machine during Pillar of Frost. And then anything on top of that was kind of like icing on the cake. So all of that to say is the gameplay is going to be pressing obliterate as much as you can. You're going to weave in rhyme. You're no longer going to be punished for hitting Frost Strike. But if you get a random mechanic 10 seconds into breath, you're still dropping it. The way this works, you are still trying to maximize that duration. I think it's just been rebranded so that it's no longer attached to this bar that is constantly filling and depleting. That's, I think, the biggest thing that is going to trip people up and make them think that this spell has changed more than it really has. So hopefully that made sense. That was a bit of a ramble. Going on to other notable changes from live, Frostworm's Fury is now 90 seconds baseline, and it stuns enemies. They took Absolute Zero and just rolled it up into Frostworm's Fury. Not too much to say there, other than it's nice for writers because now they don't have to go for Absolute Zero and pay that extra point. For everyone else, it's cool. You now have a 1 point AoE stun. It does okay damage. I think it could do more damage in the power creep of WoW. This you see in the tooltip, this 842,000. That's really not good anymore. And on a 90-second cooldown, that's kind of lame. This will really just be like a kind of an AOE stuff that also happens to do damage. Maybe if you have a fight, I'm thinking of Lehuvum from Sofo, where you would get these construct ad waves, and he would get like 20 of them at once. Frostworm's Fury could do some work there, but that's a unique situation. Generally, it is just going to be for the AoE stun. I think in the power creep of the rest of the kit, you would no longer look at this as like, oh, this is a big AoE cooldown. It's really not. It's an AoE stun with a damage component. And then the last big change from live that I think is worth talking about, Exterminate no longer resets Reaper's Mark. It now just grants Killing Machine when you hit the first scythe, and that's it. Blizzard looked at Deathbringer and probably all of the feedback they got that having a giant button that does tens of millions of damage have a chance to just happen again at full strength, and that chain could continue to chain off of itself, created really high RNG gameplay that people did not find satisfying. Even though you could break it down numerically and go, well, Reaper's Mark is 30% of your damage, and that 30%, X number are guaranteed. So there's really only this small little window that you can actually reroll. I think the fact is that people would look at, on this one poll I popped off, on this other poll I did no damage, and it comes down to Reaper's Mark, just introducing so many wild swings, and don't pay attention to that. This is a terrible talent. I just swapped over to it for testing purposes. So that wraps up kind of the biggest changes from live. And so putting the pieces of that together to do a quick recap, your rotation is going to look largely the same. Your priorities are still going to be press obliterate with Killer Machine, press rhyme. If you don't have rhyme, you're going to frost strike and fish for a rhyme proc. Empower Rune Weapon is pretty easy to use. The main ways you're going to use it are if you have no runes and no runic power, or you have no runic power and you have to press obliterate without a killing machine proc. You could throw an ERW there to get a killing machine proc to make that global a little more worthwhile. Or if you're about to overcap, there's nothing we have found yet that suggests you really need to, think about pooling your charges right before a pillar or doing anything fancy with it. It really is just use it to get yourself out of trouble and don't overcap. and you're gonna get it so frequently because of Frostbound Will that you don't have to think about like, oh, is this a good usage of it? Because your next charge is coming up fast. Cooldown use stays pretty much the same as live. You're gonna hit Reaper's Mark, Pillar of Frost, Frostworm's Fury, Pillar of Frost, Breath. Nothing too big there. Uh, Ideally, you'll throw Frostworm's Fury before Pillar, so you have more globals inside Pillar. But that's really kind of a fringe optimization, and then a multi-target. It's probably no longer even makes a difference. So, but if you want to be technically correct, you would Fury before the Pillar. Again, at least until Blizzard does something that changes this. Oh, I should mention cryogenic chamber changed. It now stores a portion of Rime empowered Howling Blasts and then detonates that whenever you cast Remorseless Winter. And so it's now become quite a strong talent by itself, especially if you take a lot of Howling Blast buffs. Frostwhelp's Aid has unfortunately gone away. I'm sad to see it go. It was a fun talent, it had good flavor. I wish it would have stuck around, and especially because they've kept the functionality where you can get a mastery buff up to 40% based on enemies hit during your pillar. It's the same thing, it's just rebranded, but it's kind of more boring now. But it is baked into a talent that a lot of people like, Frozen Dominion, that now makes your Remorseless Winter passive and attached to Pillar, and does not make Pillar incur a global cooldown. So it makes getting into AoE encounters really snappy because you hit Pillar and go. You don't drop D&D, you don't hit Remorseless Winter, you don't hit Limb because Limb is gone. You just press cooldowns and go. So what I'll do now is I'll go ahead and run through the rest of the talents and just point out anything like neat, interesting. Arctic Assault is moved way up the tree. It's basically free to get. This is good for two-hand frost and breath because it means that they can apply Razor Ice without ever having to put Razor Ice on a weapon. That works out pretty well for them. Biting Cold is the same. Gathering Storm is the same. Everfrost is mostly the same, but it also buffs your Rime empowered Howling Blasts damage to secondary targets because Howling Blast only hits the primary target for full damage. Everyone else takes fall off damage, and this makes those taking the fall off damage take more. Northwinds is its improved Rime, but upgraded. It now also makes your Howling Blasts hit a second target at full damage, and then also has the improved Rime part attached to it. It's a great talent for AoE. It makes Howling Blast, especially for Deathbringer, Howling Blast does some really good damage in AoE uh, thanks to this talent. Murderous Efficiency has just been slightly nerfed, but Frigid Executioner, now instead of making Obliterate potentially reset itself, Runic Empowerment now has a 25% chance to refund an additional rune. Makes it a lot healthier to where you can no longer have a rune spending ability refund its own cost. It increases your resource generation, but you have to do the thing that's supposed to generate your resources, not ignore that thing and get resources back. Uh, Runic Command has been buffed. It now increases your rune regeneration rate on top of your maximum RP. The maximum RP is nothing. The regen rate is neat, but I up against Runic Overflow and the fact that you only need to take 1 point to even drop down in the tree, it's okay. It's kind of one of those just leave it up to the sim questions. Runic Overflow is just improved Frost Strike, and now Glacial Advance is attached. Inexorable Assault's basically the same thing, but it consumes stacks faster. Neat, but you spend most of any encounter out that most one stack, so not too much of a change. Frost Reaper is cool. So it's improved Obliterate, rebranded, and upgraded. It looks like from the spell data that they may have been trying to do something with Soul Reaper and give it some kind of specific hook for Frost. This debuff that it describes, that obliterate procs, is the spell data for it is a exact copy of the Soul Reaper spell data for the debuff. It does the same damage. It, I think, even directly references Soul Reaper somewhere in that data. They tried something, they may have found that Soul Reaper just does not fit into the Frost rotation because it has no hooks in a spec where every rotation ability hooks into another. But as is, this talent is neat. The increased obliterate damage is nice. It's improved obliterate, but the proc is a nice little bit of flavor. It's good for two target. Some people have asked if this only works in two target. It works in one target or two target. Could say that it has a chance to tether up to two targets. And also, if you were ever refresh this for some reason, get like back to back procs, it will detonate the first proc and then apply the second one, so you don't have to worry about overriding it. But so it's a neat talent point kind of here in the middle of the tree if you want to pick up some more single target damage. I see Onslaught. This is an interesting talent. It causes your Frost Strikes to buff your next Frost Strikes. And whenever I'm saying Frost Strike, it applies to Glacial Advance too. They deal increased damage and cost more runic power, and then every runic empowerment proc resets your stacks. That pairs really nicely with Frigid Executioner, where as you spend more RP in a single action, you'll have a higher chance to proc runic empowerment, and Frigid Executioner helps offset the bad feeling that Icy Onslaught will bring by itself, where a lot of people will ignore Frigid Executioner and just play Icy Onslaught, and they will complain that the rotation feels really bad because their Frost Strike costs 45 runic power and they can't do anything because they have no resources. You really need Frigid Executioner on top because they do work in tandem. And something that's not obvious from the way the tooltip is phrased, but the buff for Icy Onslaught applies before the damage for the ability that triggered it resolves. So that means that it's effectively a baseline 15% buff for Frost Strike. The flow is you cast Frost Strike, you get a stack of the buff, you do the damage, and then if you rolled Runic Empowerment, it resets. If you rolled Runic Empowerment, you also don't up your stack count. So if I'm at 3 stacks and I press Frost Strike and it proc Runic Empowerment, I don't go up to 4 stacks, get a 60% buff, and then it rolls over. I get a 45% buff, and then it rolls over. It's really just kind of a semantics thing on like how much do they need to, how strong does this talent need to be, or how much do they need to buff Frost Strike by in order to be good. But I think that's a neat bit of trivia. We're rolling on down. Ridge of the Frozen Champion. It exists basically the same as it did. It just has tweaked a little bit now that rhyme triggers differently. Enduring Strength has a cap on it. It's up to 20 seconds. That really just is there to kind of put a ceiling on really big high rolls if you get a lot of crits. But if you look at the way this works, it starts at 6 seconds and you can extend it for up to 20 seconds. And you need to get 10 globals in Pillar of Frost that are an Obliterate or a Frost Scythe crit. It can happen. It's not the most likely thing in the world to happen. And if it does happen, you do lose a couple of seconds on this buff. It's a good guardrail just to tamp down on things to make sure nothing gets too degenerate down the road. Howling Blades is a new talent that fires these two little particles when you cast Howling Blast with Rhyme. You don't cast Rhyme, but I do like to say that almost all the time. And each of them has a 15% chance to grant Killing Machine, and they roll separately. So both of them can proc. It's rare, but it can happen. A lot of people will play this and go, wow, this does no damage, because the proc itself is really weak. The AP coefficient on it is like, it's like 11%. It's probably not that, but it's really low. This thing does no damage. And it's not supposed to because it gives you Killing Machine. And it also kind of like Icy Onslaught and Frigid Executioner here. This kind of mirrors that same synergy. This grants you more Killing Machine procs, and consuming Killing Machine has a chance to grant you a rune. They build on each other. They go together really well. We would we have to pass through Murderous Efficiency to pick up Howling Blades, but even if we didn't, we would still want to put these two in the same build. All right, moving on to the capstones. Not a ton changed here. Most of these pretty much are the same. There's just two notable exceptions. Just a brief moment of respect for Smothering Offense. We are never going to take this talent until something changes, because we have, from this row down, we have 10 points, and we have to spend 4 of them to get through here. And with your remaining 6 points, extra auto attacks through faster attack speed and more auto attack damage is just not going to do anything, especially with some of the extra ways we have to generate Killing Machine procs now. It devalues a little bit this idea that if we're swinging faster, we're generating procs more often, because we're pretty well flooded with them. In fact, we're so flooded that they introduced a brand new talent, Killing Streak, that makes Obliterate and Frost Scythe consume all killing machines, and when they do, they will deal 25% increased critical strike damage and a rolling haste buff that multiple applications may overlap. Whenever you see that, you can think Festermite, or I think Iron Fur works similarly. Basically, it means that instead of all of your buff stacks going together into one bucket and it constantly refreshes its duration, instead you're basically what you have is you have all of these mini 2% haste buffs that are all for 8 seconds, and in game it's represented as one buff, but under the hood it's keeping track of all of these separate little buffs, and they expire individually. The haste part is neat. It's not does not need to be there. All of the power in this talent is consuming all killing machines to deal increased critical strike damage. You may look at this at first and go, "Oh, so doesn't that mean you're going to want to consume on one all the time?" Because if you think about it, I consume on one stack, but I'm getting a free 25% critical strike damage on top of that. But if I go to 2, sure, it's 50% increased critical strike damage, but maybe that's less damage than if I had gotten 2 single stacks off back to back. I'll put some math up on the screen on like plays out, but the short answer is this talent is so good because it removes so much of our risk of capping out on killing machine procs, and it does good in its own right. So things like Murderous Efficiency and Arctic Assault that consume killing machine and trigger some effect, they all behave as if 2 procs have gone off. Bone Grinder 2. So because we had to pick up Bone Grinder to get this is automatically already stronger than it looks on the surface, because this is going to increase our uptime on the frost damage buff from Bone Grinder. Now, the other big thing here is that because it's letting us consume both killing machines and it's giving us some sort of bonus, it's not just like, hey, we're going to get rid of your buff stack, but you don't get anything back for it. But we do get something. It now frees us up to go, oh, I have a killing machine, let me use my rhyme. Or I have a killing machine proc, but I'm kind of low on runes, and I'm playing Deathbringer, and Reaper's Mark is about to come off cooldown. This lets you have a little more flexibility to go, actually, let me Frost Strike and get some more runes. I can use my cooldowns as they come up, and I'm not sitting there waiting for more resources. As we talked about earlier, Empower Rune Weapon is really good. You really want to be consuming Rhyme as often as possible and not wasting any procs to get more charges. And Killing Streak is really the talent that enables all of that to flow well. If we could not dump all of our killing machines at once, we would be back to the gameplay of we have a killing machine, we need to try to spend it. And especially in this new treat where we have extra sources of free killing machine, we would get back into literally only pressing Obliterate. And if we're not pressing Obliterate, we're pressing Frost Strike because we have to regenerate a rune now so we don't waste more killing machine procs, and then Rhyme gets left out in the cold. So this is a really important talent for kind of the overall rotational feel. We are never going to not play this, which means we are never not going to play Obliteration, which did get a small change. Deering Pillar of Frost, Empower Rune Weapon will make your next Obliterate or Frost Scythe not cost runes. Just a little thing to keep the rotation flowing. Finally, talk about the Shattering line. Shattering Blade is the same as it was. Frostbane is the replacement for Shattered Frost. This is really cool, and I'm sad because we aren't going to see a ton of play on this because of Might of the Frozen Wastes being kind of really strong, and you can't two-hand and play Frostbane. But I'm skipping ahead of myself. The way this works is whenever you hit an enemy with Glacial Advance, it has a chance to turn your Frost Strike into Frostbane, and that's an action replacement for Frost Strike. Where you hit it, it hits these two arcs in front of you. These arcs do damage. It does fall off damage for each enemy hit, but that counter resets for each arc. So you'll have one, and it'll hit, 5 targets and decay at each hit. And then the second one will follow up and we'll start over at full damage and then fall off. It's not listed on the tooltip anywhere, but Frostbane inherits Shattering Blade. Any enemy that it hits with 5 stacks of Razor Ice will take a bunch of extra damage and those stacks will disappear. We're currently not sure exactly how good this is. This does a lot of damage. When this hits a bunch of targets that all have 5 stacks, this is a ton of AoE damage. Biggest issue with it is that we just don't quite know how it works. I did a bunch of testing on PTR. I gathered a ton of data and then tried to sift through it, and what I came up with did not make a ton of sense. It seemed like maybe the proc rate was something like 10% baseline, and then every stack of Razor Ice was like 2.5%, or something like that. We got pretty close to like somewhere around 25% for a single target with 5 stacks of Razor Ice. And we thought that might be it. Except then at 2 targets, we saw basically the exact same behavior. We were expecting to see more procs, and we weren't, which was odd. And then we went to test at 3 targets. At 3 targets, if you have 5 stacks of Razor Ice on all 3, you're basically guaranteed to proc this with your next Glacial Advance. Or if you're using Arctic Assault, the next time Arctic Assault procs. It is like a crazy high chance. It's at least 90%, if not 95%. Huge jump from 2. And so we can't, what we don't have is like, we're pretty confident in our proc rate for the first target, and we're pretty confident in our proc rate for the 3 targets. And you could use the second target to kind of interpolate and figure out what's going on. So far, we haven't cracked it. If you go past 3 targets, let's say you're hitting 5 targets, and they all have 3 stacks of Razor Ice, 4 stacks of Razor Ice, the proc rate's still going to feel pretty low. As soon as you push them over to 5 stacks, your next Glacial Advance is going to trigger it. The biggest influencing factor is how many targets have 5 stacks of Razor Ice, and that's what makes the 2 target proc rate so weird, is that we would expect that to be noticeably higher than single target, and it's not. So this has made Frostbane fairly difficult to judge in its power in a controlled setting. Using Sims something that you can repeat over and over and over again. And so all we've really gotten are like PTR Mythic Plus logs to test this. And that's just a really small set of data. And I don't know if you guys have ever tested Mythic Plus on PTR. It's rough. Most people on there, they don't know their dungeons, they don't know the spec they're playing. You're lucky to even finish the dungeon, much less execute it in kind of a competent, like, here's our route, we're going through, we know what we're doing, we're really going to optimize and kind of push. It's very blind. So it's been hard to get a feel on this. And unfortunately, like I said, two hand can't play that. And two hand looks to take over in the next patch. Might of the Frozen Waste is the same as it was. It also now works with Frost Scythe. But part of why two hand is looking so good is it does most of its damage through Obliterate. And midway through the PTR, Blizzard buffed Obliterate and Frost Scythe by like, was it 30% or 40%? It might have been 40%. Now Obliterate is just so much of the damage we do. It's such a large share overall, or Frost Scythe is. I was doing some cleave testing, and you can see here Frost Scythe is by far my damage carrier. And so if you have a passive ability that buffs your main damage carrier by 40% or by 30%, it's 30% from Out of the Frozen Wastes, that starts to look a lot better. On top of that, we have talents that generate extra killing machines for us. We have Empower Rune Weapon to inject killing machines and runic power. We can apply Razor Eyes through Arctic Assault. So most of the liabilities that have held two hand back no longer apply. It is no longer in trouble just because it has slower autos and so it has less procs. Early data is pointing to two hand in, especially when you get the new tier sets, and especially if you're playing Rider, because Rider has extra oblit mods on it, that two hand just clear and away the winner. It's not even close. It's not down to like a personal preference thing. It's clearing away the winner. This could change. This could change before I upload this video. All that being said, it means these two talents just aren't really going to see play, and unless something changes, we'll have to wait until midnight for bigger changes then to bring those talents back. That was a lot of talking. For talent builds for this week, the week before the season launches, for those of you who are doing dungeons or clearing the raid one more time, your build will look something like this. If you're playing Deathbringer, then, but the point's flexible. Is kind of the point. And that's only for pure single target. Really neat thing about this tree that we now sort of have some distinction between single target and AoE. We can be tuned for single target and for AoE separately, and we have separate builds. And so here I have a build for Rider that is basically pure single target. This is optimizing our single target output as much as possible. But if we're doing like a raid fight that has cleave, we see here we've got these 4 talents. And it seems like a pretty hefty price to pay, but it's actually kind of neat. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and take these 2 points back, and we'll get to Biting Cold. See, now what we've done is we've made Remorseless Winter a little bit better, and we've unlocked Frost Scythe as a core rotational ability. But we've kind of split ourselves between 2 camps here. And if you played Frost for a while, you'll know with Gathering Storm and Everfrost, our Remorseless Winter does a lot of damage even in single target. Well, now we have enough points to fill out the first gate. We don't need 10% Frost Strike damage, so there's Gathering Storm. For this last point, it kind of depends on exactly what you're doing. Right now, it's looking like you would play this in Raid, but if you really wanted more AoE, you would swap Frost Reaper over. Get Everfrost. All of this is subject to further tuning and change. It'd be a good idea to double check what I have in the Wowhead guide, especially if you're watching this video like more than a week after it's published. But The point I wanted to make here is that we can now opt into a handful of talents that greatly increase great, greatly increase our cleave capabilities, and this is not a big single target loss to pick up. Um, just Frost Scythe, just dropping a point to pick up Frost Scythe, that is a hefty loss. You pick up the whole thing, you're not losing. You're losing maybe 1% single target damage. So it's enough that if you want to, if you're on a single target raid boss, you're gonna pick the pure single target talents. It's worth it. But you're not gonna make this agonizing choice between like boss damage or cleave damage when there's cleave cleave in an encounter, or of course if you're in Mythic Plus and you're thinking about boss damage versus trash damage and the whole can of worms that is. This is a very easy pickup. You don't lose a ton of priority target damage. And so Frost does maintain its strength as a spec that can do really good cleave damage. It does not need to specialize one way or the other. It means it's rarely going to be best in class at any particular damage profile, but it does mean it's going to be above average at all of them, and rarely flat out bad anywhere, which is always a good place to be. That was a lot of rambling. A lot of the internals of Frost changed. To me, this rework was really about giving Frost lots of new knobs and ways to tune it, and breaking up some of the toxic patterns that have been present in Frost for several seasons now, where we have a lack of talent variety, and I play the same build everywhere. We're only pressing obliterate. A lot of the things in the spec that feel like they should matter kind of don't matter. This rework breaks all of that up. So the resulting gameplay is still going to feel very similar. You proc Killing Machine, you press Obliterate, you proc Rhyme, you press Howling Blast. It's not reinventing the wheel, but it's leaving Frost in a much healthier spot. It's leaving Frost in a way where now when they want to tweak something specific about Frost, they can do it without upsetting the whole house of cards. When we start topping DPS meters because we're really good at Ovanax, when we get nerfed for that, now Blizzard can nerf us for just that. And they don't have to nerf for a single target, and then we're bad for the next two raid fights, and then good again, and then kind of mediocre for the last one. Frost's tuning lately has been gets too good at AoE, gets nerfed, single target gets bad, too bad at single target, gets buffed, and the cycle repeats itself. That's no longer going to be the case. With Rework and Jagosa, they've tried to tune its duration before, and it's been really tricky because to tune its duration meant messing with the resource economy, and that can feel very off very quickly. Unholy players know this from Sudden Doom, and how kind of an innocuous sounding change to like, you're gonna just tweak the runic power cost on this proc, it'll be fine. The way that it ends up like rippling out and having kind of a not fun effect on the overall exchange of resources. But now with Breathless and Jagosa, they have a very specific knob that they can tune to get the duration where they want it without upsetting the rest of the spec. If consuming Killing Machine starts giving less of a duration extension, that doesn't make me start ignoring Killing Machine. Now I know someone's gonna say like, yeah, it's one dimensional now because you just consume Killing Machine. I rambled about this before. The gameplay has not, I think, fundamentally changed from live. I don't think the gameplay is what all of us want it to be. I think a lot of us want that like really min max breath, do a lot of damage with it back. But unfortunately, I don't think that's where the game is at right now. With hero talents existing, it feels like a lot of that kind of like really min max optimizing things in most specs is kind of less of a thing than it was in expansions past. that's a whole tangent. This is what you get when I record this at like 1:30 in the morning. I get a little bit incoherent. I'm gonna have to see how this shakes out in the editing room. Finally, one more thing to touch on. I'll close this out with stats. The thing everybody always wants to know. What are my stats? We were crit mastery. Now we're mastery crit. With all of the free killing machines from Power Rune Weapon, crit's not quite as valuable as it used to be. We're no longer like stacking crit out the wazoo. Now mastery is our best stat for both hero talents by far. Crit, it's not far behind it. Just if you have the choice between crit or mastery, you're gonna lean mastery most of the time, unless you're in the first diminishing returns. Um, and then you look to spread things out. After that, haste and verse aren't really relevantly ranked. Rider is a lot fonder of haste because haste buffs the horseman. But that's kind of a little bit more of a single target thing. Once you get into AoE, more of your damage comes from mastery. But all that being said, nothing really fundamentally has changed. You're just going to lean mastery heavy. Deathbringer is going to go really lean on haste. Rider is totally fine with haste. And then, versatility should be your lowest stat. I think I'm going to wrap this up here because I've been talking for a long time, much longer than I had planned to. I'm sure there's stuff I missed. I definitely did not talk too much about the upcoming season or what I think like the meta builds are going to be, other than it's going to look something like this. Builds without breath don't really exist for two hand. If we take these points back, we look at where we can spend them. It's nothing super exciting. We would at least spend to here, and we're playing two hands, so we're not going to take Shattering Blade. Avalanche is really weak. Yeah, it's going to be something like this. Right now, once you get the tier set, it'll probably be Riders everywhere, unless something changes. Before tier set, sim yourself. It's going to be dependent on your gear. Riders is good, but Riders also gets a lot of power from its tier. I'll talk more about that in like a season 2 specific video. This will get you through this week, and of course, all of this info is repeated in the Wowhead guide, and it will be up to date in there. Videos go out of date. Text guides, you can update them at a click of a button and with just a few keystrokes. These videos are just a fun thing to do on the side. Go on fun rambles for a bit. If you are still with me, like 40 minutes into this is basically just turned into a one-man podcast. Thanks. I appreciate you sticking through all this. Hopefully my ramblings were interesting, and I'll see you at the next video.